You have been living inside a contract you did not sign with ink, but with fear. The contract was written early, when love arrived with conditions and silence arrived with consequences. It was signed at a kitchen table where your words were weighed before they were spoken, during phone calls where your tone mattered more than your truth, at gatherings where you learned to soften yourself so the room would remain intact. The psyche learned quickly. Survival required accommodation. You became fluent in explanation. You learned to justify your existence in advance, to apologize before being accused, to offer yourself as proof of loyalty so that abandonment would not be triggered. This was not kindness. It was a strategy born of dependency. You were assigned a role before you had language for refusal. In one family it was the peacekeeper. In another, the achiever. In another, the listener who absorbed what could not be spoken. The role promised belonging in exchange for obedience. The price was authority. Over time, the role thickened into identity. What you call patience is often fear of expulsion. What you call empathy is frequently vigilance. What you call love is sometimes an agreement to remain small so that others do not have to face themselves. This is not pathology. It is structure. A structure the psyche builds when the ground is unstable. I have watched this mechanism for decades. Not in books, but in the quiet hours when a person speaks without ornament. It is always the same moment that reveals it. Someone is standing near a sink or a doorway, rehearsing a sentence that will be softened before it leaves the mouth. They are about to explain a boundary but already preparing the apology for having one. The body leans forward as if asking permission to occupy space. The eyes scan for approval. The self withdraws while the persona negotiates. This is the scene it repeats. The psyche does not forget the conditions under which it was allowed to exist. It carries them like invisible laws. You believe you are choosing your relationships, your work, your compromises, but often the choice has already been made by a complex that fears exile more than falsity. The father or mother does not need to be present. Their image has been internalized and it governs with greater efficiency. The complex does not argue. It compels. It whispers urgency. It produces guilt without cause. It rewards compliance with temporary calm and punishes differentiation with dread. There is a particular fatigue that belongs to those who live this way. It is not the tiredness of effort but of erosion. Each concession thins the outline of the self. Resentment accumulates, not because you are unkind but because something essential has been repeatedly postponed. Authority is lost quietly. Others sense it without knowing how. They push not because they are cruel but because the boundary is porous. The psyche repeats what is unfinished. This is the compulsion. The same scene with different actors. The same conversation with altered faces. You call it bad luck. It is fidelity to an old agreement. There is a moment, usually after a long season of endurance, when the psyche turns against its own arrangement. Symptoms appear not as enemies but as messengers. Exhaustion, sudden anger, a collapse of motivation, a dream that disturbs the order of things. The dream often carries a house with missing walls or a room no one is allowed to enter. Sometimes there is a child guarding a door. Sometimes an animal that refuses to be led. These images are not decorative. They announce that the structure has reached its limit. The role can no longer contain what has grown beneath it. Night at Bollingen carries a certain clarity. The air does not negotiate. The fire burns according to its nature. When the river moves, it does not ask permission from the stones. In such silence, the psyche reveals its economy. It does not seek comfort. It seeks balance. When one pole dominates too long, the opposite gathers force. Excessive accommodation summons revolt. Prolonged loyalty to what diminishes you calls forth a counter-movement that will not be polite. You believed that enduring would earn you safety. But the psyche was actually preserving the conditions of your diminishment. The consequences become visible. Relationships that depend on your self-erasure, work that consumes without recognition, intimacy that requires performance. The mechanism is possession by a complex that equates belonging with obedience. The persona becomes inflated in usefulness while the self recedes. You are praised for what you provide and unseen for what you are. There is an ancient image from the Greeks that clarifies this condition. Orpheus descends into the underworld to retrieve what he loves. He is permitted to lead it back under one condition: he must not look back. He fails not from malice but from doubt. The backward glance destroys the possibility of return. Psychologically, the glance is the need for reassurance, the refusal to trust the process of separation. Each time you look back to see if love is still there, you break the movement forward. The underworld is not punishment. It is the place where unexamined agreements reside. Another silence settles. Frost gathers on the stone. The owl's call is not a command. It is a fact. The first darkening of this work is ruthless because it must be. You are asked to see what the role has cost you without embellishment. Not only energy but the capacity to stand without justification. Not only time but the ability to say no without explanation. The psyche records every unspoken refusal. They accumulate as bitterness or despair. This is the blackening. It is not depression in the moral sense. It is the stripping away of illusions that kept the arrangement intact. You believed your kindness was keeping relationships alive. But the psyche was actually preventing reciprocity. The consequence is imbalance. The mechanism is an unconscious contract. I will remain agreeable so that you do not leave. You will remain so that I continue. Neither party is free. The contract enforces itself through guilt and fear. Breaking it feels like betrayal, not because it is wrong, but because the complex experiences differentiation as annihilation. The image that often arises here is Egyptian. The heart is weighed against a feather. It is not sentiment that determines the outcome, but density. A heart burdened by unlived life becomes heavy. It sinks. The psyche does not condemn. It measures. What you have carried that was never yours adds weight. What you refuse to carry that was yours removes it. This is not moral. It is mechanical. Ash gathers after a long burn. In that residue something pale appears. Awareness does not arrive as relief. It arrives as clarity. You see the contract. You see how often permission was sought for what never required it. You see how projection operated. You believed others needed you to remain as you were. But often it was your own fear that demanded the performance. This is the whitening. Separation begins not by force but by recognition. The psyche withdraws its investment from the old agreement. At this stage, many are tempted to replace one role with another, to become rigid where they were flexible, cold where they were warm. This is still possession. The opposite pole seizes control. The work requires holding tension without collapse. Authority is not aggression. It is gravity. It does not announce itself. It is felt. There is a Gnostic image useful here. The false god who demands worship in exchange for order. Psychologically, this is the internal authority that claims to protect you while feeding on your compliance. When the archon is exposed, it does not disappear. It loses power. It can no longer command. It can only suggest. This is a crucial shift. The voice remains, but the obedience ends. The night deepens. Iron cools after the furnace. The stars do not hurry. You believe that setting limits would destroy connection. But the psyche was actually testing whether connection could survive truth. The consequence of avoiding this test was a life arranged around anticipation. The mechanism was fear of separation rooted in early dependency. When the limit is finally present, some bonds fail. This is not a tragedy. It is a revelation of structure. What depended on your absence cannot endure your presence. A dream often marks this passage. You are standing at a threshold. On one side, familiar voices call. On the other, silence. The fear is not of the unknown, but of losing the script. The script provided cues. Without it, you must respond from somewhere else. That place is the self. But it has been long unattended. It does not persuade. It stands. Firelight flickers against wood. The room holds as the old agreement dissolves. Something red emerges. Not passion in the romantic sense, but vitality reclaimed. The psyche begins to unify what was split: kindness without compulsion, loyalty without self-betrayal, closeness without captivity. Authority returns not as dominance, but as coherence. You no longer need to explain your existence. Explanation was the language of dependency. Presence is the language of the self. There is a biblical image that captures this without piety. Jacob wrestles through the night. He does not win by strength. He persists. He is wounded and renamed. Psychologically, the struggle is with the internal authority that governed him. He does not destroy it. He integrates it. The limp is the mark of individuation. Authority carries cost. The air grows still. Pine resin sharpens the senses. You are not late. The psyche does not hurry its transformations. What appears as delay is often incubation. The years spent negotiating, enduring, explaining were not wasted. They revealed the limits of the arrangement. They prepared the confrontation. Now the contract has lost its force. It may still present itself, but it no longer has access. The self does not announce victory. It simply sits. From there, choices change without drama. You do not withdraw to punish. You do not advance to prove. You remain. Those who require your disappearance will find no entry. Those who can meet you will adjust or depart. The script ends not with applause but with silence heavy enough to hold you. Silence after such a rupture is not empty. It is dense like air before snow. The psyche reorganizes itself when an old agreement dissolves. And this reorganization is rarely gentle. What once provided orientation collapses. For a time you may feel unmoored, not because something is missing, but because something false is no longer compensating for the absence of truth. The mind searches for familiar reference points and finds none that respond. This is not confusion. It is withdrawal of projection. In this interval, many experience a peculiar loneliness even when surrounded by others. Conversations continue. Obligations remain. Yet something fundamental has shifted. You are no longer fully available to the role that once animated these exchanges. The old reflex to explain yourself weakens. Words arrive slower. The psyche is conserving energy, redirecting it inward, away from performance and toward consolidation. This stage is often mistaken for regression. It is not. It is incubation. You believe that clarity would feel like relief. But the psyche was actually removing scaffolding that had disguised imbalance. The consequence is exposure. Without the role, you are seen more plainly and you see others with equal clarity. The mechanism is the collapse of persona inflation. What remains is not emptiness, but a more exact proportion between inner and outer life. There is an image from alchemy that belongs here: the washing of the blackened matter until its residue becomes pale. The water does not comfort the substance. It cleanses it. What dissolves was never essential. What remains resists dissolution because it belongs to a deeper order. In psychological terms, this is the separation of habit from necessity. Many behaviors you assumed were virtues reveal themselves as adaptations. Their disappearance leaves a stark simplicity. Night again presses against the walls. The fire settles into embers. Nothing asks to be improved. At this point, another danger appears, subtle and seductive. The psyche, relieved of one possession, may offer another. You may find yourself identified with detachment, with distance, with a new austerity that feels like strength. This too can become a role if seized unconsciously. Withdrawal hardens into superiority. Silence becomes a weapon rather than a boundary. This is not individuation. It is inversion. The shadow has simply changed costume. You believed that becoming unreachable would protect you. But the psyche was actually testing whether you could remain open without surrendering authority. The consequence of rigid withdrawal is isolation that masquerades as sovereignty. The mechanism is shadow identification. The rejected opposite takes control. What was once excessive compliance becomes excessive refusal. Both are governed by fear. A different image must be allowed to emerge. Consider Persephone, who moves between worlds. She is neither captive nor sovereign alone. Her power lies in rhythm, in the capacity to inhabit depth without being consumed by it and return without denial. Psychologically, this is the capacity to engage without forfeiting center. It is not learned by rule. It emerges when the self is sufficiently seated. The psyche signals this seating not with enthusiasm but with a quiet firmness. Decisions become less dramatic. You notice that you no longer rehearse conversations in advance. The impulse to manage outcomes weakens. You speak or you do not without strategizing. This is not indifference. It is alignment. The frost deepens outside. The ground holds. You believed that being understood was necessary for peace. But the psyche was actually exhausting itself trying to translate what needed no defense. The consequence of this belief was chronic explanation. The mechanism was an unconscious appeal to authority figures internalized early, whose approval once determined survival. When that appeal ends, peace does not arrive as comfort. It arrives as neutrality. Things are allowed to be what they are. There is often a dream at this stage of a house that is finally inhabited. Rooms once locked are entered without ceremony. Some are bare. Some contain objects long forgotten. Nothing needs to be arranged for display. The house is no longer a set. It is a dwelling. This image marks a return of ownership. The psyche recognizes itself as home rather than guest. Salt appears frequently in these inner images. It preserves and separates. It stings when applied to wounds, yet prevents decay. Psychologically, salt is discernment. Not every impulse is followed. Not every invitation is accepted. This discrimination is not moral. It is metabolic. The psyche regulates intake according to capacity. A pause lengthens. Wind moves through branches. The sound is unadorned as authority consolidates. Relationships reorganize themselves with little negotiation. Some intensify, relieved of unspoken debts. Others wither, deprived of the nourishment they once extracted. This can be misread as loss. It is more accurate to call it sorting. Structures dependent on asymmetry cannot survive symmetry. The psyche does not intervene to save them. You believed that loyalty required endurance of discomfort. But the psyche was actually measuring whether loyalty included the self. The consequence of excluding the self was a subtle self-contempt. The mechanism was moralization of suffering. Pain interpreted as virtue. When this mechanism dissolves, suffering loses its justification and demands resolution. There is a biblical image that clarifies this without sentiment. Job is stripped of every explanation. His friends offer reasons. He rejects them. The psyche, like Job, refuses consolation that falsifies experience. When no explanation remains, something else speaks. Not comfort but presence. This presence does not argue. It answers from a different register. The stars emerge one by one. They do not console the darkness. They coexist with it. At this juncture, time feels altered. Urgency recedes. Decisions are made when they must be, not when anxiety demands them. This is not passivity. It is trust in an internal regulator that no longer requires constant supervision. The psyche has re-established hierarchy. The self occupies the center. Complexes resume their proper place as contents, not rulers. You believe that vigilance kept you safe. But the psyche was actually sustaining a state of low-grade alarm that prevented rest. The consequence was chronic tension. The mechanism was anticipation rooted in early unpredictability. When authority returns, vigilance relaxes. Not because danger disappears, but because response is available without rehearsal. The furnace image returns here but differently. Metal that has been sufficiently worked no longer resists shaping. It holds form. Authority is not rigidity. It is integrity under pressure. The psyche demonstrates this when you encounter familiar provocations and find no reflexive response arising. The absence is not suppression. It is completion. Another silence. The fire dims. The river beyond the trees moves without witness. As this integration deepens, language itself changes. You speak less about yourself. When you do, it is factual, not confessional. You no longer narrate your intentions to secure understanding. This is often misinterpreted by others as withdrawal or coldness. It is neither. It is economy. Words return to their proper weight. The Gnostic image of the archons loses relevance here because their jurisdiction has ended. The psyche no longer requires false intermediaries. Authority flows from within outward, not from imagined external judges inward. This shift is irreversible, though it can be resisted. Resistance appears as nostalgia for the old intensity, the drama of negotiation. But drama was compensation for imbalance. Its absence reveals proportion. Night deepens further. The stone cools. Nothing demands resolution. You were prepared for this moment not by accumulation of strength but by attrition of illusion. Each compromise that failed to secure safety revealed the limits of the old strategy. Each relationship that demanded your disappearance clarified what could not be carried forward. Preparation was subtraction. What remains is sufficient. There is no announcement when the family script loses access. It simply stops generating commands. Invitations arrive without hooks. Guilt appears without urgency. The psyche observes these phenomena as weather rather than law. This observation is not detachment. It is sovereignty. The ending of such a process is often mistaken for beginning. It is neither. It is settlement. The self does not promise fulfillment. It occupies space. From that occupation, life proceeds with fewer explanations and more exact consequences. Authority is felt as gravity. It bends interactions around it without effort. When the psyche settles into this new center, it does not become louder. It becomes less available to interruption. What once could summon immediate reaction now passes through a longer corridor before reaching response. This corridor is not indifference. It is evaluation without anxiety. The old reflexes knock, but they are not answered. Not because they are forbidden, but because they are no longer relevant. There is often a strange phase here in which the outer world appears almost unreal, as if seen through a thin veil. Familiar dramas unfold, yet they do not penetrate as they once did. You hear the same complaints, the same expectations, the same attempts to pull you back into function, but the hooks no longer find purchase. This can feel uncanny, even disorienting, because intensity had been mistaken for meaning. The psyche is recalibrating its sense of reality. You believed that engagement required emotional immediacy. But the psyche was actually confusing proximity with truth. The consequence of that confusion was over-involvement. The mechanism was projection. You entered other people's inner weather as if it were your own. When projection withdraws, the boundary between inner and outer becomes perceptible again. This boundary is not defensive. It is structural. An image from astronomy clarifies this shift. A planet does not argue with gravity. It maintains its orbit because the mass at the center is sufficient. When the center weakens, trajectories become erratic. When the center strengthens, movement stabilizes. Psychologically, the self functions as mass. It does not persuade the complexes. It orders them by its presence. The night sky over the lake holds this logic without commentary. Constellations persist whether named or not. As authority consolidates, the psyche begins to test it. Old patterns return briefly, not with the same force but as invitations. A familiar request arrives, framed as necessity. A subtle guilt resurfaces, polished and reasonable. These are not regressions. They are examinations. The psyche asks, without words, whether the new center will hold under familiar pressure. You believed that refusing would require justification. But the psyche was actually watching whether the refusal could exist without narrative. The consequence of justification was continued negotiation. The mechanism was an unconscious belief that explanation creates legitimacy. When explanation is withheld, legitimacy shifts inward. The refusal stands without defense. This is often the point at which others accuse you of change. The accusation carries an edge, sometimes even grief. They sense the loss of access. They may recall your former availability as virtue. Psychologically, this is the mourning of a structure, not of you. If you respond by reassuring them of continuity, the old contract stirs. If you remain as you are, the mourning completes itself or turns into resentment. Both outcomes clarify reality. Another silence intervenes. The fire emits only heat now. No flame. The room does not comment. In dreams during this period, animals appear with increasing frequency. Not domesticated creatures, but those that move according to instinct. Wolves, birds of prey, serpents. They are not threats. They represent functions reclaimed from repression. Instinct had been subordinated to approval. Now it returns as guidance, not as impulse but as orientation. You believed that instinct was dangerous, but the psyche was actually deprived of its regulatory intelligence. The consequence was overthinking. The mechanism was mistrust of bodily knowledge, often learned in environments where spontaneous response was punished. As instinct reintegrates, decisions require less deliberation. The body knows before the mind constructs reasons. Iron imagery emerges again, but now as structure rather than furnace. Beams, hinges, tools. Authority expresses itself as reliability. You do not need to announce limits because they are felt in how you move. Requests adjust themselves before reaching you. This is not intimidation. It is coherence. The tension of opposites remains, but it is held rather than resolved. You can feel care without obligation, distance without hostility, firmness without cruelty. Earlier, these qualities collapsed into one another because the psyche could not tolerate ambiguity. Now ambiguity is endured. This endurance is strength. You believed that certainty was necessary for action. But the psyche was actually immobilized by the demand for moral clarity. The consequence was delay. The mechanism was fear of error rooted in conditional acceptance. When authority returns, action proceeds without moral display. Consequences are accepted as part of reality, not as verdicts on worth. There is a biblical image that belongs here, the burning bush that is not consumed. Psychologically, this is vitality that does not destroy its container. Passion without compulsion, engagement without self-loss. The fire remains fire, but it no longer requires sacrifice to prove its legitimacy. A brief stillness. Frost outlines the window. Breath is visible. At this depth of integration, time spent alone no longer feels compensatory. Solitude is not a retreat from injury. It is a condition for listening, not to voices that command but to movements that arise spontaneously. The psyche communicates less through urgency and more through resonance. You find yourself drawn to certain work, certain conversations, certain places without justification. Attraction replaces obligation. You believed that discipline meant forcing yourself into alignment. But the psyche was actually seeking conditions under which alignment could occur naturally. The consequence of force was resistance. The mechanism was an internalized authority that confused control with order. When that authority dissolves, discipline becomes economy of energy rather than coercion. The image of the threshold becomes prominent now. Doorways, bridges, borders. You are often neither fully in nor fully out. This liminality is not indecision. It is calibration. The psyche pauses at thresholds when something irreversible is forming. Rushing would fracture integration. Waiting is not avoidance. It is gestation. Another quiet interval. Wind passes over water. The sound does not ask to be interpreted. As the self stabilizes, the need to be seen diminishes. Visibility had been compensation for invisibility in early life. Now recognition, when it comes, is received without hunger. When it does not, nothing collapses. This neutrality is often mistaken by others as arrogance or aloofness. It is neither. It is the absence of demand. You believed that being overlooked was intolerable. But the psyche was actually reacting to earlier erasure. The consequence was pursuit of affirmation. The mechanism was a complex that equated attention with existence. When the self occupies the center, existence no longer requires witnesses. The final transformations at this stage are subtle. They do not announce themselves as milestones. You notice them only in retrospect. A conversation that once would have destabilized you passes without residue. A request that once would have been accepted automatically is declined without drama. A silence that once would have felt like rejection now feels like space. Salt returns as image but now dissolved in water. Preservation and flow combined. Discernment without rigidity. The psyche no longer rehearses old arguments because there is no internal court demanding defense. Judgment has been internalized and then surpassed. Authority here is not judgment. It is placement. Things fall where they belong. Another pause. The embers fade to glow. The room holds its shape. What remains to be completed is not effort but consent. Consent to inhabit what has formed without apology. Consent to allow consequences without mitigation. Consent to let relationships reorganize according to reality rather than memory. This consent is not chosen repeatedly. It is assumed once and thereafter maintained by gravity. You were prepared for this moment because only now can you remain without performance. Earlier, the self would have been hijacked by fear or idealization. Now it stands with sufficient weight to resist possession. The complexes still exist. They no longer rule. The family script may attempt one last appeal, often through nostalgia or moral appeal. It may remind you of who you were, what you once gave, what is expected. These appeals carry less force now. They sound like echoes rather than commands. The psyche recognizes them as remnants of an outdated economy. This recognition is quiet. It does not require declaration. The script simply stops running. When the old script finally exhausts itself, it does not collapse in a dramatic scene. There is no confrontation worthy of memory. It ends the way outdated laws end, by no longer being enforced. You notice one day that an invitation arrives and nothing in you leans toward it or away from it. Another day, guilt passes through like a draft in a corridor. Felt but not answered. The psyche has withdrawn its energy. What once compelled now merely appears. This is the stage most people never recognize because it lacks emotional signature. They expect transformation to feel like release or triumph. Instead, it feels like sobriety. A quiet accuracy replaces intensity. The inner weather stabilizes. You are no longer searching for signs that you are allowed to be here. The question has dissolved. You believed that freedom would feel expansive. But the psyche was actually narrowing itself to what is essential. The consequence is simplicity. The mechanism is consolidation. What cannot be integrated is discarded, not in anger but in disinterest. Desire becomes precise. Aversion becomes calm. The noise of internal debate fades because there is no longer a divided authority. There is an image from metallurgy that belongs here. After repeated firings, the metal reaches a point where further heat adds nothing. Its structure has been set. To apply more force would only risk fracture. Psychologically, this is maturity of form. The self does not require further testing to prove its integrity. It holds under ordinary conditions, which is the only proof that matters. The night air at Bollingen carries this quality. Cold enough to sharpen perception. Still enough to hear distance. No one speaks to it. It does not respond. At this depth, compassion returns, but without the old distortion. You can see suffering without being recruited by it. This is often misinterpreted as hardness, especially by those accustomed to extracting regulation from you. In truth, this is the first form of compassion that does not destroy either party. It allows the other to carry what belongs to them. You believed that helping meant absorbing. But the psyche was actually confusing fusion with care. The consequence was depletion. The mechanism was identification with the other's pain as proof of worth. When identification dissolves, care becomes possible without self-erasure. This care is limited. It ends where responsibility ends. The Greek figure of Narcissus clarifies this from another angle. The tragedy was not love of self but incapacity to differentiate image from substance. He was consumed by reflection because there was no center from which to relate to it. Psychologically, this warns against both self-obsession and self-negation. The self that has formed here is neither enthralled by its image nor hostile to it. It recognizes reflection as reflection. A quiet interval. The fire has gone out. Only warmth remains in the stones. One of the last residues of the old contract is the urge to explain your change to those who question it. This urge appears reasonable, even generous. But explanation invites negotiation. Negotiation implies doubt. When authority is intact, explanation becomes optional rather than necessary. You may speak if you choose. You do not speak to secure legitimacy. You believed that silence would be interpreted as guilt. But the psyche was actually discovering that interpretation is not yours to manage. The consequence of managing it was continued entanglement. The mechanism was an unconscious belief that misunderstanding equals danger. When that belief dissolves, misunderstanding becomes tolerable, not because it is pleasant but because it no longer threatens existence. Dreams now shift in tone. They become shorter, less dramatic. Often they are simple scenes, walking a familiar path, repairing a small object, sitting with an animal. The psyche no longer needs to shout. Its messages are integrated into waking life. The boundary between conscious and unconscious becomes more permeable, not through flooding but through cooperation. Salt and ash appear together in these images. What preserves and what remains after burning. They mark an economy that has learned its limits. Another stillness. Dawn does not hurry. At this stage, the question of timing often arises. You may look back and wonder why this authority did not arrive earlier. Why so many years were spent negotiating with shadows. This question misunderstands the process. Authority that arrives before its time becomes tyranny or inflation. The psyche required exhaustion of the old strategy to withdraw its allegiance from it. Only when compliance failed to secure safety could the deeper center emerge. You were not delayed. You were contained. Containment is not stagnation. It is the vessel in which transformation occurs without disintegration. The image of the vessel is central to alchemy, but it is rarely understood psychologically. The vessel is not the goal. It is the boundary that prevents loss during change. Your early roles, however constricting, served as vessels. They held you until the contents matured. When the pressure exceeded the vessel's capacity, it cracked. This cracking was necessary. What spilled out could now reorganize at a higher level. A faint light enters the room. Dust is visible in the air. As the self settles fully, the need to oppose the family system also diminishes. Opposition was necessary during separation. It is no longer required during integration. You do not need to convince anyone that the old rules no longer apply. You simply do not respond to them. This non-response is not passive aggression. It is irrelevance. You believed that disengagement required justification. But the psyche was actually moving beyond the field in which justification had meaning. The consequence is freedom from argument. The mechanism is relocation of authority from relational contracts to inner coherence. Biblical psychology offers one final image here. Elijah hears the divine not in wind or fire but in a thin silence. Psychologically, this is the recognition that truth does not always arrive with force. When the psyche is no longer fragmented, truth does not need volume. It is obvious. Another pause. The morning holds. What follows is not a new chapter in the narrative sense. It is continuity without strain. Work continues. Relationships continue, but without the background noise of self-betrayal. When conflict arises, it is addressed directly or not at all. When desire arises, it is examined without moral panic. When fatigue appears, it is respected as information rather than weakness. You believed that worth had to be maintained through effort. But the psyche was actually exhausting itself trying to secure something that could not be earned. The consequence was chronic vigilance. The mechanism was a conditional model of love internalized early. When this model dissolves, worth ceases to be a variable. It becomes a given, not as belief but as fact of existence. The stars are no longer needed to orient you. The ground suffices. There is no final instruction to be given here. Instruction belongs to phases of dependency. What remains now is alignment. The self does not guide through commands. It exerts gravity. From that gravity, choices fall into place or away without ceremony. The family script, stripped of access, becomes an artifact rather than an influence. You may remember it with clarity, even with tenderness. But it does not dictate movement. It cannot compel guilt because guilt requires agreement. That agreement has ended. This ending does not feel like hope. Hope implies uncertainty. This is certainty without promise. You stand where you stand. What approaches must meet you there or not at all. What departs does so without pursuit. The psyche rests.